Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is going to look at the reasons the United States came up with a new written constitution about 10 years after its original founding in 1776. By the time this video is done, you should be able to explain why it was so hard to develop a new system of government in the United States and describe the strengths and weaknesses of America's first written form of government, the Articles of Confederation, as well as the short and long-term causes of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where the U.S. Constitution as we know it today was composed. Before we start here, make this chart in your notes with one side being a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. We're going to talk about several of those. And as we go over this unit, you should add into your notes how the new Constitution addressed those particular weaknesses. So again, make sure you put this in your notes and know where it is because we'll be going back to it several times over the course of this unit. A lot of the difficulty with creating a national government in the early days of the United States came from the fact that there was really no blueprint for how to do this. The United States was the first nation in the history of the world to have been a colony and then won its independence from the mother country, being Great Britain, obviously, in the Revolutionary War. It was also the first country that was going to be based on Enlightenment ideals, these ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, property, and the idea that no government could take those things away. The vast majority of countries up to this point had been founded based on royal mandate, and whatever the monarch said went. And that was not how the United States was going to operate. That was fairly well agreed upon from the beginning. But like I said, a lot of people had no idea what this country should look like or how it should be set up. The original 13 states had been fairly autonomous before 1776. They pretty much did their own thing and really had no true sense of unity among them until the 1770s on the eve of the American Revolution. So they were used to doing their own thing without having anyone else tell them what to do, and that sort of continued even after the Declaration of Independence in 1776. You had a Continental Congress, but they didn't have a ton of power, and most of the governmental authority was still sort of based at the state level. The Revolutionary War also led to a lot of turmoil and uncertainty about what the government should look like. You may have heard the adage before from people who opposed the American Revolution in the colonies: why trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? So there really wasn't this big push to have a strong central government. In fact, people were scared, or at least wary, of having this big national government that, if it was given too much power, could erode their freedoms. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of skepticism regarding creating a big national government. So with those fears in mind, the Continental Congress went about drafting the Articles of Confederation in 1777. When you've looked at American history before, if you're not really familiar with the details of American history, you may have always wondered about the seeming gap in America's history between the Revolutionary War and when George Washington took office. The Revolutionary War is from 1775 to 1781, and the Declaration of Independence was during that in 1776. But George Washington doesn't become president until 1789. So some of you may have wondered before, what happened in that intervening period? Well, that was the period where the Articles of Confederation were in effect. They were written in 1777, but as a harbinger of bad things to come, I suppose, the document did not become legally binding until all 13 states had ratified it. And it wasn't until 1781 when Maryland got around to ratifying it at the state level, and it finally took effect. The Articles of Confederation set up a one-branch government. There was a legislature, a Congress of the Confederation, as it was called, or they informally just refer to themselves as the Continental Congress, as they had been known during the Revolutionary War. And they were to make all national government-related decisions. And we'll talk about this here in a minute. It set up a very weak national government. As we said before, the states had always viewed themselves as being sovereign. They saw the United States as a loose collection of independent states, not as one strong nation. So the Articles of Confederation sort of perpetuated that and ended up causing a lot of difficulties for the new country that would eventually have to be addressed. We can now take a look at what the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress that was created by it did well. It's not a particularly long list. The Articles of Confederation gave the Continental Congress the power to make peace, and they did that by signing the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which finally officially ended the Revolutionary War and granted the United States formal independence from Great Britain. It did take some time, though. The fighting phase of the Revolutionary War ended in October of 1781 with the Continental victory at Yorktown, but it wasn't until 1783 that the treaty was ratified. The Articles of Confederation also provided for a way to survey new land that was acquired by the United States. The Land Ordinance of 1785 divided frontier land into very rigid square townships of 36 square miles, 6 miles by 6 miles. Each of those was divided into 36 sections of 1 square mile, and then those were further divided out. And this provided sections of land that could then be sold to settlers, and it was a way to populate that land with the goal of eventually turning those territories into states. You may notice on the township system diagram there that section 16 is highlighted. That's known as the education section. Every township of 36 square miles had to have 1 square mile devoted to education, or it could be sold and the money would then go to funding public education in those areas. So this is an area where public education was very, very important from the get-go, even when it wasn't as important or emphasized in some of the original 13 states. Later came the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which cleared the way for the old Northwest Territory, which again is that highlighted area in that map, to be admitted to the Union as states. Most importantly, it forbade slavery in the new states after they were admitted to the Union with full statehood. So that will eventually become fairly important in the fight over slavery leading up to the Civil War. But as I said, that's about all that the Articles of Confederation did particularly well. Here's what the Articles of Confederation did fairly badly. The Confederation Congress was incredibly weak, especially when you compare it to today's United States Congress. They could not raise money. That was probably the biggest weakness they had and the root of a lot of other problems they had down the road. They could request money from the states, but the states were in no way required to give them squat. So this caused major problems during the Revolutionary War because the Continental Army was pretty much broke the entire time, which almost led to ruin on numerous occasions, trying to fight a war with no financial backing. Only 1 vote per state in the Continental Congress. So regardless of the size of your state, whether you were the biggest state, Virginia, or the smallest, Rhode Island, your state got 1 vote. So the larger states are not going to be too thrilled about that. In order to get anything passed through the Congress, 9 of the 13 states had to agree, and these are states that never particularly got along in a lot of cases and had very, very different interests. So getting 9 of the 13 states to agree to anything was pretty difficult. If they wanted to change anything in the Articles of Confederation, if they wanted to amend it, it had to be completely unanimous, which was even more impossible than getting something passed through in the first place. They could not very effectively conduct diplomacy. They were giving very little power to regulate trade with other countries or conduct any kind of treaty or anything like that. And in many cases, states would make their own trade agreements with foreign countries, which seems kind of hilarious today, but back then that was a major problem. The Continental Congress didn't have a lot of power to make the states do anything they said because there wasn't much of a army in place or anything like that. So it's like the joke about British police officers who don't carry guns, like, stop or I'll say it again. instead of stop or I'll shoot. They could say to do something, but the states could pretty much just ignore them. Also, again, as I said a minute ago, only one branch of government. There was only the Continental Congress. There was no executive branch. There was no leader of the government like we view the president today, and there were no courts. The function of national courts was conducted by committees of the Continental Congress, which proved most ineffective. As we mentioned before, during this time, states sort of, remained autonomous as they had been really before the Revolution. They wrote their own state constitutions with different types of government. Some were weaker state governments, some were fairly strong and sweeping in their scope and what they were able to do. This was a time when states were pretty much independent one from the other, and the national government had virtually no power. You could honestly say that by the mid-1780s, the national government of the United States was just hanging on by a thread. And there were plenty of people who thought that Great Britain or even France were going to swoop in and reconquer the United States because they were so weak and susceptible to foreign agitation or conquest. No state maybe had a weaker state government than Massachusetts. This was illustrated with crystal clarity by Shays' Rebellion. First, a little background. In the 1780s, there were a lot of people in Massachusetts, like poor farmers who were veterans of the Revolutionary War, who were massively in debt because they hadn't been paid much during the war. There was a series of bad harvests and stuff, and they just didn't have any money to pay like their mortgages on their land. And the Massachusetts government, for the most part, had been fairly forgiving and not too keen to collect that debt so as not to anger people. But then in 1786, a hardline governor came into office who decided they were immediately going to start collecting those debts. And Daniel Shays, who was a former Continental Army officer, got together a band of ticked off Continental veterans who were in the same boat as him, and they began harassing government officials. Most importantly, they wouldn't allow the courts in Western Massachusetts to do their jobs. They would basically form, big lines of soldiers outside or rebels, and they wouldn't let the judges and court officials in to conduct business because part of their business would be to foreclose on people's mortgages and take people's land. The problem comes from the fact that Massachusetts didn't really have a state militia and didn't have the power to raise one. So despite the fact that there are angry rabble-rousers in the streets, causing a lot of trouble, the state couldn't do a single dadgum thing about it, nor could the national government. They finally, in an act of desperation, got some volunteers together and were able to put down the rebellion without too much difficulty. But a major flaw in weak national government or even state government was exposed, that when there is a disturbance of some kind, you've got to be able to deal with it. And if Shays' Rebellion had spiraled out of control, the national government reasoned this could have spelled, major disaster for Massachusetts or even for other states in New England. So it became fairly apparent that you needed something stronger than the Articles of Confederation or a state government like that to deal with potential issues and be able to raise money and things like that. So, as I was saying, this led to a call to improve the Articles of Confederation. And so in 1787, a constitutional convention was called that was going to meet in Philadelphia. It was ultimately led by George Washington. And again, their first mission was to just make the Articles of Confederation better. But once they got there and began looking at the issues that the country had and how best to fix those, ultimately, the decision was just made to scrap the Articles of Confederation and start all over with a brand new document, which of course was the Constitution of the United States. So that will do it for today. In class and in future videos, we will look at how the Constitution was actually created and how it addressed the Articles of Confederation's shortcomings. As always, be sure to ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!